Professor Vali, thank you so much for joining us in this series that we've got going out of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Emirates. I think we're going to wait maybe, a couple more seconds for a few more people to drop in, and then hopefully we'll be able to start. So the series started out as a set of conversations that took place between fellow diplomats in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This was my reaction and my department's reaction to the absolute certainties that I heard from everybody else. With all due respect, there is so much uncertainty in the current political environment, international environment. It becomes very interesting to hear what people across the world are thinking. So you're one of the people we're speaking to. I think we're going to be speaking to people out of China, people out of the west coast of the US and elsewhere. I'll just give you a couple of ideas that I'd like to throw out there. A lot of the media coverage of the COVID pandemic really concerns internal policy in the UK and Russia and China and in the US. And it's presented as a local domestic issue, but we also know that there's this increasing rift between the US and China, which will play out throughout the epidemic or the pandemic. But there's another issue that seems to be even less discussed, and that is the knock-on effects to fragile states, smaller states, states that don't have healthcare systems that can accommodate huge numbers of COVID victims. So I'd like you maybe to start thinking about those ideas and maybe give us an impression of what you see.
So first of all, thank you very much, Your Excellency, for inviting me to this series. It is wonderful to be part of this and to have this conversation. It's also wonderful to see you, despite our separation. I think these are very important issues. What we're seeing is that we had anticipated for a while that US-China relations was going to become more tense, more of a rivalry rather than cooperation. President Trump had been pushing in that direction very much, but now we are seeing a sudden collapse, if you would, in the relationship. And this is largely driven, I think, by the fact that in the United States, China now has become a domestic political issue. Mm-hmm. And there is a concerted effort by the president and many in his circle to basically deflect from a lot of the political consequences of the pandemic by focusing the blame on China. Mm-hmm. In other words, and that has a life of its own. In other words, once you begin to say that China is responsible for 30 million Americans being out of work and trillions of dollars of economic loss to the United States, and the fault lies with the Communist Party of China, with the way they do business, you're really going down a very difficult path. So I think the sudden shift in US-China relations is very clearly a game changer at a global level. Sort of if you want to call it, this geostrategic reset. And it's not easy to think that how the United States and China will revert back to the way things were, even if the pandemic was to stop tomorrow morning. So this is part of our new reality going forward. And that has its own impact on countries like UAE, countries in Africa, countries in Southeast Asia, which have trade and relationship with China, but also have trade and alliances with the United States. I think they will find it much more difficult to balance these relationships going forward. But in a way, the pandemic, even in countries like Turkey and Iran, where the numbers have been very huge, has first and foremost not been a healthcare issue or a crisis, although it is a real serious crisis. And there are many, maybe theories about why we haven't seen the same kind of a ratio of deaths per million, let's say, that we see in the West. But it is definitely a massive economic crisis. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's a case that the United States and China could sneeze, and countries all the way from Thailand to South Africa on to Argentina are going to catch a severe cold. Mm-hmm. And that's very much the case. What we are seeing is that the economic downturn in China and the United States has basically stopped demand. for commodities, oil, for instance, in the case of the Middle East, for varieties of products of what we call developing countries, successful emerging markets, as well as fragile states. And then, the supply chains have been disrupted. Manufactured goods, machineries out of China, products out of the West, and most of the developing world and even most of the wealthy emerging market countries really don't have the ability to launch stimulus packages of the kind that either United States or even Saudi Arabia, China have launched. They don't have extensive foreign reserves. So, you have a sudden massive shock to their economies. We're not discussing that much on CNN, New York Times, Guardian, on Western media, but it is a massive sort of problem that's looming over the horizon. What is the secondary shock of this economic problem that has arose out of the lockdowns in the West and China, on a host of countries that were either doing well or were struggling. I mean, I give one case that a country like Bangladesh, which was being lauded as a success case of having brought large numbers of people out of poverty on the back of exports of textiles to the West, is now seeing a systematic degradation of its fundamental industry. And many are thinking that about 500 million people may be pushed back into poverty as a consequence of the pandemic.
It's astounding. And how do you think, well, because we're sitting here in the Middle East, in the United Arab Emirates, I mean, we have a government that has taken some very concerted action. We were very early in picking up signals from China, what was going on. And I know that, senior government officials were already discussing what action should be taken in the third week of January. So in a sense, we're very lucky that we have an alert and focused government here. And we have taken other steps where we've spent a lot of money transferring assistance and aid and medical supplies to, I think, just under 50 countries, hundreds and hundreds of tons of goods. But there's only so much you can actually do. I mean, the Emirates is a significant, but it is nevertheless a small country. And if we look around the region, we see a set of either reforming states or states in conflict, internal or external. How will COVID now feed into these current conflicts? And do you think that geopolitical tensions will rise as a result of COVID, or is there some other alternative outcome we might plan for?
It's a very interesting question. So the way we might frame it is that is COVID likely to accelerate and expedite the negative trends that we were already seeing, like say conflicts in fragile countries becoming even more endemic, countries that are teetering on the edge of being fragile actually collapsing into being failed states. I mean, an example I give in the Middle East that many people are talking about is Iraq, is a country that is barely stable, and now its oil revenue has been slashed by 2/3, and it relies on oil revenue for 90% of its government revenue. So a poorer Iraq will be even more unstable than was the case. So that's one theory, that COVID is going to accentuate all the negatives that we already were witnessing, whether in the Middle East or globally, by and large. The other question is that COVID is such a massive event in world history that it's bound to reset, be a geostrategic reset. It's bound to pivot certain countries in new directions, right? But there is no way in which development models, political priorities, national interests might not be re-examined and re-evaluated going forward. So I think that what you laid down is that we started in January, February with what was a healthcare crisis. Some countries like UAE, New Zealand, Taiwan, South Korea, Denmark, largely actually smaller countries with very coherent technocratic healthcare systems and decisive leadership did very well in the first part. And some countries, including the United States, or Iran or United Kingdom, ironically, a hodgepodge of different countries did very poorly in that first wave. The second wave was then economic wave, which is, and countries like UAE, Denmark, New Zealand cannot be immune to it because they're part of the global economy. In fact, the more UAE became part of the global economy, I would say in the past decade, the more vulnerable it would be to changes in global dynamics. So, as I mentioned, demand collapsed in the West, supplies was disrupted, then the price of oil collapsed. And now a lot of countries around the world are trying to deal with what is a major economic crisis. That's the United States, it's Argentina, it's China, it's Japan, it's a whole host of countries are dealing with economic crisis. Now, looking at history, we also know that major economic shocks have political and strategic consequences. There are governments whose relationship with their own populations are going to change. The social contract they have with their people has to be renegotiated. For instance, if an African country is subsidizing, certain sector of the economy, it may no longer be able to do so. If in countries that are, let's say, multi-ethnic, and certain ethnic group is being subsidized from the center, and that's keeping the peace in the country, those things may come apart. I mean, a case in point is under economic pressure right now, Pakistan might be renegotiating a distribution of resources to its provinces under the 18th Amendment of the Constitution, which actually has kept ethnic peace in Pakistan for the past decade and a half, 2 decades. So will that change the dynamics internally? I think regional priorities are going to change because wherever in the world you are, foreign policy is tied to how much attention you need to pay to stability at home. Stability at home has to do with bread and butter issues. So in a way, the third wave, which we're going to see over the horizon, and we're not there yet, is that we're going to see countries, essentially, they're not admitting it right now. We would have to sit down and see what's the most important priority for them. Priorities of populations change. And then they're going to look at this US-China rivalry. They're going to look at what's happening in their own neighborhoods. And then they say that, okay, how does that change my foreign policy priority? Look at the price collapse of the price of oil in our neighborhood. You take a country like Algeria, its comfort zone might be around $150 a barrel. At $15 to $20 a barrel, it has a massive gap. So how will Algerian government's priorities change? How will that impact North Africa's priority changes? So it is possible to think that some of the trends that we saw in the past may not be there in the future. And countries may back away from certain conflicts because they have other priorities. And at the same time, new conflicts may arise which demand their attention. Conflicts that were not there before, that will demand their attention. But also, I do think that there are some openings that are there. For instance, you mentioned UAE using this opportunity to help 50 different countries with both facilitating and providing medical assistance during a time of crisis. So that's a diplomatic opening that didn't exist with countries before, most notably, let's say, with Iran. For instance, despite all of the tensions between UAE and Iran, UAE has played a very important, critical role in providing very critical medical assistance. Now, doesn't matter what the government necessarily thinks about it, people know it, and that changes the reaction of the people to these sets of issues. So it's possible that that opening may help reduce tensions. But all of what I said essentially means we're going into a period of great uncertainty. Because, as I said, some conflicts may not matter more. We may have new conflicts. We have certain new openings that may yield positive results in certain places, but we may also have an aggravation of the situation. And then on top of this, we have this U.S.-China dynamic now playing out, which will put additional pressure on all the countries basically who have been part of the Belt and Road story with China. And at the same time, the Chinese themselves may no longer have the same amount of available funding to sustain some of the relationships they've invested in. So I would say every country now literally has to go back to the drawing board and not think about the world the way it was before COVID, but begin to do scenario building about the possibilities of the future. And I would have to say, Your Excellency, that is the biggest problem right now in foreign policy thinking. I mean, sitting here in Washington, if I thought, and if I looked at most of the foreign policy debates around the world, it's as if the pandemic has not happened. Really? As if the United States has the same financial capacity to pursue every foreign policy objective as before, as if the rest of the world is not going to go through this. And I think very soon we're going to arrive at this exercise. And if countries like UAE, like the conversation you're having, countries who start thinking about the future and how their own region and the global environment may be different, will be ahead of the curve, just like they were ahead of the curve at the healthcare crisis at the beginning.
Well, it's interesting because from my conversations with a whole bunch of people, there seem to be, for small and medium-sized states, there are kind of two different ways in which the thinking goes, at least again, in my experience. One is fairly idealistic. This is time to reach out to other countries. This is the time to remind ourselves that we work in a multilateral world. Diseases cross borders, and so on. There is another point of view that says, this is the time to double down on our own strengths and make sure that, we can't secure the world, we can't secure the region, but we can secure our own kind of basket of goods, our own territory, our own population. And, obviously we're dependent on other countries, but perhaps it's best to double down and make sure that we're in a good state. And then, you have the China-US rivalry that then feeds into that. It becomes, again, very, very difficult for states to stand up and say, well, we prefer this outcome. So again, how do you look at that, and how do you deal with the uncertainties around that? And how does a small to medium-sized state kind of maximize its own stability, prosperity in a world where, every single day the news changes and we get new directions from, sort of senior figures?
Very, very interesting questions you raised. So the first part of it, I would say that both of the sentiments that you've heard are correct, and they're both correct at the same time. In other words, countries talk about contributing to, the international commons, let's call it, to global things, and they talk about why don't we reach out to other countries, and at the same time, countries still try to maximize benefits for their own country. This is what we call national interest. Sure, in other words, even in the past, we were pursuing national interest, which means that we reached out and rewarded countries that benefited us, and we punished or tried to guard against countries that harmed us. The only difference is that because the context has changed, you have to reevaluate the national interest. In other words, is it beneficial right now to help country A? And is it beneficial now to protect yourself against country B? And given the chaos in the international order and the economic crisis we're facing, what are the tools that we need right now? Let's say if in the Middle East oil was at $140 a barrel, countries may contemplate using oil wealth in different ways than when oil is at $15 a barrel. Right? Sure. So I think what we're seeing is that countries have to sort of reevaluate how do they basically protect themselves and protect their wealth and provide for their populations the best they can right now. And they have to sort of see what opportunities COVID presents them and what specific threats are post-COVID that maybe didn't exist before COVID. Now, the second part of this is a challenge that everybody's facing, which is it's one thing to conduct a foreign policy where you sort of can see 10 miles ahead of you. And it's a different kind of a foreign policy when you are basically not seeing the road in front of you. You're driving in a very thick fog.
Yeah.
And you have to be extremely alert, and you may make some mistakes, and you may hit a thing or two on your way. It actually requires, I think, in the, let's say, 5-year period, when we're thinking, it requires investing in capacity. So it requires pooling all your national capacity in terms of vigilantly monitoring the way ahead. Let's not even think about the regional level. Let's think about the US-China level. This has for decades been a fairly stable, if you want to call it, a beam that has been running under the international system. Yes, the Americans griped about China. Yes, the Chinese misbehaved. But for decades, this relationship was hugely predictable. To the point that you could actually build your economy and foreign policy around the certitude and certainty of US-China relations. Now, this relationship, nobody can tell you where it's going to be in 2 months. Is it going to become even more conflictual as we get closer to November in the United States? Is it going to become less conflictual and both sides see some sanity? We cannot predict how China is going to react to an aggressive United States, and we don't know how aggressive the United States is going to get. So literally monitoring US-China relations itself is going to become a full-time job for many countries. And that includes larger countries like South Korea and Japan, all the way to smaller countries like the UAE or let's say New Zealand. And in a way, there is no simple solution for this, except I think countries that recognize the problem sooner, like you just mentioned, and begin to build capacity for it, are likely to be able to better manage and navigate this, that those who right now are basically not paying attention to the fact that tomorrow is going to be very different from yesterday and are not actually building capacity for dealing with it.
So when you say building capacity, I agree with you, but then you have to decide what it is that you're building capacity for. There's a whole set of choices there. I think you also mentioned that the economic wave will have had effects on the UAE, and that there might be a rewriting of social contracts across the area. I think that's absolutely right. And particularly in the UAE, the Prime Minister has already gathered the government on a number of occasions. He's come out and publicly stated, must have been 2 months ago, that things will not go back to normal. There is no normal after this, and that life has changed fundamentally. And for the Prime Minister of the UAE and the ruler of Dubai, who had built Dubai out of the dreams of others, to then see that everything has now gone digital online is fascinating. And also the great kind of focus of government on reimagining itself, reinventing itself. Obviously, oil revenues have gone down. There's a focus now on shrinking government, merging ministries, and becoming really focused on what comes next. So there is actually, in spite of the difficulties, there's a great deal of optimism and a lot of smart thinking that I've discovered taking place, which is great. But you're also absolutely right that, there are very clear signs that social contract is changing, and that we're really going to be focusing much more on education, health and education, but also developing relationships with other countries on the basis of what kind of intellectual assets, technological assets we may be able to share with them or acquire from them. And we're really going to become much more knowledge-focused government and population. So in a sense, it's very exciting. But at the same time, to look around the entire region, and you look at Libya, you look at Yemen, you look at Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, the issue of refugees, and what the future holds for them. It's incredibly kind of disconcerting and worrying as well.
No, absolutely. I think I would look at UAE at one level, at a global level, as part of the global conversation. That there's no place in the world you look at that you don't see a change in social contracts, be it United States or China or in Europe. And largely it's logical, because your original social contracts or original economic relationships with the population was designed in a different kind of an economic environment. And now that the world is the economic environment has changed, automatically it changes the social sets of relationships. And I think countries, again, that are able to react faster and react more decisively or end up going to do better. Just like we saw a differentiation in the outcome of the pandemic in countries based on how they reacted with their healthcare systems. The same is going to go with the economic and the social contract part. So I think UAE is doing all the right things. And if we were to say, you put it in a basket of a set of international examples of how countries are dealing with their social contracts and the changing economic context, I think it looks very favorable. The other issue that you mentioned, which is a particular challenge that UAE and small, medium-sized countries in the region face, is that they're sitting amidst very large countries that are far more fragile than they are. I mean, if you look to the north to Iran, you look to the south to Saudi Arabia, you look to Egypt, you look to Algeria, and we're not even going to look at the Yemen and Libya and Syria, which are already. So, there's a set of countries that are much less likely to be able to address the problems that are before them for varieties of reasons. But turbulence, instability in those countries is directly relevant to what smaller countries like UAE would like to achieve. And in general, in the current global environment, I think small, medium-sized countries have both a regional and global context to think about. So they are part of the global economy. They still need to navigate that. But they're also part of a region that they cannot control the outcome there. So UAE can decide on how it's going to reform its own economy and prepare it for the future. It cannot decide that about its neighbors or the larger players in the region. And consequently, I think it will have to navigate this going forward based on how those countries fare coming out of this. We still don't know how the economic impact of COVID is going to translate into political dynamics in a lot of the countries in the Middle East.
Yeah, I mean, there was you mentioned Iran. There was a lot of talk about Iran being one of the epicenters of COVID very early on, and the number of people who were getting ill and dying. And then, the news kind of dried up. Is there anything you can tell us about the situation there? And there's a kind of a follow-on question from that. The Gulf states have generally always had an issue with Iranian influence across the region. And it occurs to some of us that for opportunistic players, COVID actually could be a great opportunity for them to continue the work of, manipulation of foreign populations. So if you have anything to say on that.
Well, first of all, yes, correct. I mean, Iran was an early epicenter for COVID. At one point, it was right after China was the largest number. And even if the numbers in Iran are not really truly reflective of the size of the crisis, but what some of the sort of doomsday scenarios about what the pandemic is going to do to Iran has not materialized. Now, a lot of theories also about generally in countries like Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, even Russia today, the structure of their healthcare system combined with demographics of the population may have produced certain different results. The second issue is that the West and the United States, United Kingdom performed so poorly on the pandemic that it actually diverted a lot of the attention from Iran. Even within Iran, the Iranians are very well aware that the United States or European countries performed quite poorly. So the political ramifications also did not become what it was. But one thing is very clear, that the economic impact of pandemic on Iran is tremendous. Starting from the collapse of supply chains coming out of China because of the shutdown in Wuhan, to closure of borders with Iraq, Turkey, and Afghanistan for a period, to collapse of oil prices. That in a way, the pandemic has accentuated the impact of the severe economic pressure that the US had already imposed on Iran. So that clearly, I think, will have an impact ultimately on a lot of internal political conversation in Iran, about the social contract in Iran, and ultimately about the direction of the Islamic Republic in Iran. There's no downplaying how severe the economic pressure has been. Now, unlike what the predictions in Washington was, it has not led to regime collapse or a new nuclear negotiation. Mm-hmm. But I don't believe that going forward, even if you took a 2 to 5 year window, that it will be without a consequence for the direction of the country. Now, yes, one could think that if Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, other countries become weaker, more fragile, it does provide an opportunity for Iran to extend its influence, and maybe it will make an effort to that. But at the same time, also there are a lot more pressures on Iran itself internally because of the economic situation. As well as also, shoring up the Iraqi government or the Lebanese government. It's a very expensive proposition right now. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's what I meant, that, it's one way of thinking about any country's national interest and priorities as if pandemic hadn't happened. And mm-hmm. thinking that at some point that every country would have to reassess its priorities based on its capabilities and its own internal situation. And I don't think Iran will be immune from that. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to say countries always make the right decisions when their leaders sit down and reconsider. And there's a lot of factors that are on the table. But I would say that, the Middle East as a whole is changing as a consequence of the pandemic. Iran itself is changing as a consequence of the pandemic. And ultimately, the calculations about what are Iran's national interests may also not play out based the way we thought. And I underscore the word may. I mean, mm-hmm. the whole point about this is such a big global event that we cannot really assume that it does not have any kind of an impact on the way we move forward. So we have to wait and see, how this calculation plays out in Iran.
So what would the key indicators be, the ones what should we be looking out for coming out of Iran and even from the region, so that we can recalibrate our approach?
Well, I think Iran is different from the rest of the region because with Iran there are some clear signposts. It's in an intense sort of battle of wills with the United States, that the U.S. is using pressure, including the pandemic, to break their will, to get them to the table or see some kind of a change of government in Iran. Then they have, obviously, for Iranians, there's the American presidential election, which is very important. Are they going to be dealing with another 4 years of the same administration or a completely new administration? And then Iran has its own presidential elections next June, which could decide mm-hmm. the direction of the Islamic Republic for at least the next 10 years. So I think a lot of the internal calculation for Iran is to stay the course until it passes these signposts. Other countries in the region do not necessarily have these things. But I would say in the region, what to watch for is that maintaining support for a number of conflicts in the region are quite expensive in the current environment. The key issue is that even tacitly, countries decide to back away from escalating at least these conflicts. Doesn't mean they're going to wash their hands of of their interest in these arenas, but they may decide that right now, putting another $1 billion into this conflict is not beneficial. I think the choice of the new, let's say, prime minister in Iraq seems to be an unspoken compromise that both Iran and the United States favored this particular prime minister. Maybe the United States favored him more than Iran did. But I think if you're sitting in Tehran, you're not saying I'm going to leave Iraq, but you're saying that if Iraq completely collapses, and that means pouring even more money into Iraq. Do we want to do that right now? Can we afford to do that? Maybe we agree to a compromise for the time being until we see what happens later. So I think the first indicators is whether we see a kind of the conflicts in the region essentially become frozen for now. Mm-hmm. Maybe there's no peace talks right away. Maybe there is. I mean, we'll see what happens in Yemen based on the Saudi initiative with the Houthis, whether that gets somewhat better. Maybe there's not an actual end to Libya, Yemen, Syria right now, but what we might see is at least the conflicts being frozen, no more resources going into a knockout win at the moment. And then we might begin to see some desire on the side of the parties to wind them down, maybe even begin de-escalating. So those are the early indicators. If we don't see those, if we actually see more money going into these conflicts and escalation of the fighting, then that's a very different outcome.
Do you think that might be a backlash in countries where Iran is a player because of, say, the breakdown in the economies, the breakdown in health systems, the paralysis, for example, in Lebanon? A lot of people will attribute that to Iran. Would that be a factor to consider now?
Absolutely. I mean, ultimately, every foreign policy measure a country takes has a certain economic, political cost to it. So for a very long time, the political cost for Iranian foreign policy in Iraq or Lebanon was minimal. There was no outright active resistance. If the resistance becomes much more, at the same time, Iran would have to calculate what is its capacity and capability for sustaining a particular posture in those countries. Mm-hmm. So it would have to sit down and calculate. And that's what I mean, that we might begin to see an inclination not to overreach or not to increase engagement, but rather either to stay in place or maybe even back away some. Exactly because the cost of resistance is too much, or the cost of owning the problem is too much, or even the cost of maintaining this engagement is too much. That doesn't mean that peace is going to break out in the Middle East tomorrow. I'm not saying that at all. Yeah, but I'm just saying that, looking at the economic battering Iran has taken, looking at the fragility of Lebanon and Iraq, I think, you would sit down and recalculate what you need to do. And that applies to all countries in any sets of conflicts, whether it's in Africa, in Asia. If Arab countries that are involved would also sit down and calculate where are they going to be spending their resources? What's most important to them? Are they going to be involved in 5 conflicts at the same time, or are they going to prioritize these conflicts? Let's say, for instance, it's a while since Saudi Arabia has not been financially deeply engaged in Lebanon. It's doubled down on Yemen, saying that's the most important thing for it is Yemen, not Syria, not Lebanon. Not to say that it doesn't have opinion on those or it doesn't criticize Iran, but it has prioritized. And we're with more meager resources, and also the possibility of more countries being fragile, I think countries will have to prioritize. Let's say if you're sitting in Saudi Arabia and you have to say, look, if Egypt begins to wobble because of it, is Egypt a higher priority or another place where receives Saudi funding? Or if Algeria begins to wobble, what is the priority? So I think Iranians would have to go through the same exercise as well, that if there might be a point at which they cannot necessarily sustain all of these conflicts or their support for the various factors, and they would have to prioritize what matters to them more. And I think that could provide certain room for maneuver in the region.
Just when you spoke about Iran and national interest, perhaps I've read the wrong documentation. I always thought that there were very powerful local domestic institutional interests as well. That can kind of distort national interest. If I was sitting in Tehran, I'd have a very different view of what the national interest was. I'd be focusing in on economic development and prosperity for the citizenry rather than what is often referred to as foreign adventure. So.
No, it's absolutely right. I mean, national interest in every country is the subject of debate, and there are stakeholders in terms of that. And I agree. And I think, exactly the kind of pressure, economic pressure that Iran is facing is potentially going to make economic discussions in Iran more prominent and urgent than maybe they were before the pandemic. And yes, and countries could make it continue on the path they were, but the COVID could also be a pivot point. That's what I mentioned, that across the world, one can think of COVID as actually accelerating trends that we've already seen, but potentially it could be a reset moment. And I do think that in Iran it's going to be interesting that now that the economy is weakened so much, whether or not it becomes a point where the economic well-being of the country becomes a higher priority than it has been treated before.
Here's a question that occurred to me that you may not know much about, but I mean, so many conflicts around the world are basically supplied with weaponry from certain states. Do you think COVID is going to affect military supply chains and perhaps have a knock-on effect on some conflicts?
I think so. I think, first of all, the producers of weapons are even more incentivized to sell. I mean, one of the reasons Russia is objecting to snapback sanctions on Iran at the United Nations is because it was getting itself ready to start selling weapons to Iran, and maybe it's now even more eager to start selling weaponry to Iran, and similarly with China. But on the other hand, I think, again, every country as it debates what it's going to do with fewer dollars, fewer amount of money, it comes a question whether how much is it going to spend on its military. And if countries decide that they need to reduce their defense budgets, then they need to reduce participation in conflicts that requires the defense budget.
Of course,
Which takes you back not only to the discussion about Iran, but there are a number of other countries. Like, let's say if you looked at countries like Pakistan or Myanmar, for instance, where the military accounts for a huge part of the national budget. If the national budget shrinks, then the defense budget has to shrink. And that gives an incentive then to military forces to try to encourage economic development in order to maintain their defense expenditures. So I do think it problematizes a great deal of spending on war and on defense. And countries can continue to do that. I'm not saying necessarily that national leaders always make the right decisions when they sit around the table and discuss what's the national priority. But in some countries, domestic stability is also important, and domestic stability now requires investment in economics. And I don't buy necessarily that always foreign adventure is a good way of diverting attention from domestic politics. It doesn't always work. And so if it doesn't work, then there's no option but to take economics seriously.
But before COVID, there was obviously a huge amount of illegal migration from North Africa into Europe. What are the kind of the prospects for that being kind of mitigated, especially with the threat to so many jobs in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa as well?
Well, actually, COVID is creating a much greater impetus for migration. I think the first wave will be economic migrants. So as Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco are beginning to feel the pain of no tourism, manufacturing, exports to Europe declining, you're going to have a lot more incentive among young unemployed people to try to migrate to Europe. And particularly in the case of North Africans in France, Spain, Belgium, Netherlands, there already exist networks that they can rely on. They have cousins, uncles, etc., that will probably begin to go to. Now the question is, what would the Europeans do about this? I don't think it's on their radar now. And then the second wave is that if you actually have political conflict in the region, let's say a regime collapses, you have civil war, you have regional war, you have escalation of existing conflicts, whether they will actually end up producing much larger number of migrants. Now, one of the, I think, mega themes for now is that, the conflicts of yesterday, the threats of yesterday still exist. Whether it's the way, let's say, UAE or GCC countries view Iran, or or the United States views China. But in reality, the larger threat to everybody is the pandemic, more than any particular country. Because, and migration is a very good case. The pandemic has the potential of creating large waves of population movements even within the Middle East. Let's say countries that deal with COVID well at the beginning and actually have a more of a viable economy will become target for migrants from countries in which the economy is basically hopeless, right? So, and the largest players in the region, the ones with a lot of excess labor, are the ones that are right now economically most in danger.
Of course,
so you look at Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, Iran, Jordan, and you would say that if the economy continues to decline in these places, that you're going to begin to have displaced populations even within the region. And that's destabilizing. That can be a source of new conflicts in places that we don't even anticipate. And then on top of that is that where does this population go if it begins to migrate out of the region? And the primary target is Europe, and that can have then significant impact on domestic politics in Europe. If the Europeans take very decisive action, it could have other kinds of ramifications as well.
Well, somebody here has asked the question: will COVID increase the rise of populism in the world? I'll shorten that, or rather change that slightly to say, will it lead to a rise of populism in Europe itself, even prior to COVID?
Right now, many people think yes, or at least some of the arguments of the populists, like close the borders, and also another argument of the populists is that every country needs to solve its own problems. Yes, the pandemic is a global issue, but the United States actually decided not to be of help, and even the Germans were first looking after Germans, even though they've done a lot for the rest of Europe. So every country basically has to take care of itself, and so we're back to sort of a more of a national argument of my country first, and I have to build my own capacity instead of investing in European capacity or in the international system. We need to build our own capacity, which is a populist argument. But I think that where the populists fail is that they really don't have very strong technocratic answers for the problem. In the end, COVID is a problem that needs experts to solve it. It needs scientists, economists, capable technocrats to manage and solve it. And that community is not part of populism. So even if we're going to see populism today, in the future, it might be a different kind of the populism than we've seen in Italy or in England. These governments have not performed well. I mean, Boris Johnson has not done well in England. Populism is not a winner. So even if it's going to be, English nationalism, UK nationalism, it has to be one that has a different kind of a language than the one we've seen so far.
Well, if I could say, just on the point of Boris Johnson and the UK, I found it fascinating. They have very good media, so we can watch a lot of what's happening. We're very familiar with domestic kind of politics and news of the UK. But I discovered recently that following the science was not as simple as following the science, and that actually scientific advice can be very heavily politicized. So that's almost a lesson for the rest of the world, where they don't necessarily have scientific research and development. That actually science is not is not sort of devoid of value. That there are very, very critical value judgments that must be made before you can implement scientific approaches. Which again makes me think of why in the Emirates we seem to have done actually very well early on with the issues that we faced here.
That's right.
There are a bunch of questions here as well. One of the questions I thought maybe if you could just give 2 points on. How will this, I mean, what are the direct effects of the China-US rift on the Gulf states? I mean, what are the key choices that, you know, will be presented with? We may avoid making those choices. We may find other ways to deal with them. But what are the key things? Usually I hear about technology issues and Huawei.
Well, that sort of is the canary in the coal mine, or
right.
proverbial low-hanging fruit. So pressure on UAE and other GCC countries not to buy into Huawei, buy into Chinese technology. And this, it won't stop here, because I think the next big technologies are going to be around public health, and are going to be around the sort of frontier technologies for surveillance and contact tracing, and models that may require countries that buy into them that to be much more closely coupled with China. And you know, the absence of cooperation between US and China has created, if you would, an arms race in these arenas. You know, my vaccine first, or my healthcare system first, and so those become very, 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 very key. And then, you know, there might be certain pressures on trade, you know, and trades of particular things, which ultimately may be meaningful to UAE. It may not be meaningful. It might be in things that you care about or not. Those would be on an ongoing basis. But I think one of the bigger challenges down the road is that if we end up in a place where begins to look a lot more like Cold War, and as in every international arena and on every international issue, how you would vote becomes a measure of your loyalty. And it becomes you're either with us or you're against us mentality. So whether it's on today's World Congress that the World Health Organization is holding, do you vote for Taiwan being a member or you don't? It becomes a test. Are you friend of China, or are you friend of the United States? And then it goes to every single thing you do at the United Nations, at any international agency, on every international conflict. You take the side of China, or do you take the side of the United States? That, you know, puts a small and medium-sized countries in a place they don't want to be. Whether it's UAE or Singapore or Malaysia, they don't like to have to choose sides and then face the consequences of potential punishment by the other side. They don't want to, you know, side with China and then, you know, lose public relations mileage in the US by being portrayed in American media as or by a particular congressman saying, you know, you supported China. Vice versa, they don't want to have to support the United States and then the Chinese penalize them in a particular way. You know, most of the small, medium-sized countries, emerging markets, have prospered in a world in which US-China relations was not a binary choice. They could have very successful trade with China. They could have very successful trade and relationship with the United States. And the problems between these two countries didn't become their problems. So UAE won't be alone. I mean, there's virtually every country in ASEAN is going to face the same problem. And then, you know, the next level, which might be 5-10 years down the road, is on the military level. When the US and China both may look at their ports and their bases essentially as much more aggressively as garrisons than they do right now. So I think that's the challenge that small and medium-sized countries face in a world in which US and China are going to be at it.
So small and medium-sized countries, what is it that we can do to lead on any of these issues, do you think?
Well, I think one definite thing is that an individual small and medium-sized country like UAE or Singapore is very hard pressed to resist this trend or to be influential in it. So they have to band together in many ways. You know, already Southeast Asian countries have ASEAN, so they could always adopt an ASEAN policy.
Yeah.
And ASEAN as a collection of 9-10 countries is much better placed to push back against China or push back against the US in a particular circumstance. But I do think UAE, not in the Middle East, because Middle East doesn't have that kind of an environment, but should find global partners of equal size and interest, and maybe even sponsor a club of countries that are like-minded, of the same economic status, have the same level of integration into global trade and globalization, and ultimately will have a vested interest in not being forced into, you're either in my camp or you're in the other camp. And it might find it much easier to defend its trade positions if UAE, India, Malaysia, ASEAN, they're all sort of adopting a similar position vis-a-vis Huawei or vis-a-vis trade with China. I think that's the best option for small and medium-sized countries. You know, they joke that either when elephants fight or when elephants make love, the grass gets trampled underneath. So you want the two elephants just to sort of stand aside and do neither necessarily, and definitely not fight.
Right. I had a whole bunch of questions in my mind. There was one question somebody put, which is this, there is a question generally, is this the end of neoliberalism, or are we going to see even more as soon as the immediate financial crisis is over?
My sense is that after the immediate end of the financial crisis, we're going to see more economic nationalism.
Yeah.
For the reason that every country needs to lick its wounds right away. And as you mentioned earlier, needs to see where its strengths are, build on those strengths, and try to get competitive advantage. And secondly, because the main champion of neoliberalism at the global level is actually missing in action, which is the United States. Yeah. China is supportive of mercantilism, which means that I maximize benefits to me without any kind of a investment in a normative international order. Yeah. Now down the road, once we have more stability, I think we could be back to where countries begin to understand that they're not going to grow any further under economic nationalism. So economic nationalism is good for stability, is good for crisis management, but generation of prosperity requires going back to globalization. You have to allow for more freedom of movement of labor. You got to allow for more freedom of movement of information, and you got to allow for more trade if everybody's going to prosper. But I would say that probably is what we're looking at more medium run 5 years onwards.
Because, you know, the Gulf states and countries like the Gulf states have been speaking about food and water security for a long, long time. And I think COVID has been a real jolt. All of a sudden, you know, there's a threat not just to food being traded, but actual food production in countries that were well known for it. And so there is this kind of a reaction to say, well, not just economic nationalism, but self-sufficiency in some way. A focus on trying to find the right technologies, the right groups, the right set of scientists and managers who can actually help us fill the gap.
Well, definitely. I mean, that goes also with the idea that many countries are going to explore diversification into economic sectors that could protect them against the next big COVID, right? And that does require investing in exactly things you said. So food and water is one. You know, if tourism is too vulnerable to an economic downturn like this, maybe there has to be other service sectors countries can go to, manufacturing. There's a variety, and for small countries, it might make sense to actually even build partnerships with other small countries in order to create critical mass for certain industries.
Of course,
if there's a common interest, there might be common electricity, common water, common food. I mean, let's say the next frontier for GCC beyond security may well be in the economic arena. And this is one of those opportunity issues we were talking about at the beginning. So yes, absolutely. But again, that takes you so far. And then at some point you were going to say that generational wealth still needs going back to sort of neoliberalism. So if we went back in history, many countries' development, let's say South Korea, started in the 1950s and 60s with building self-sufficiency in industry, cars, steel, and all of that. And then the second phase was that how do we actually make these, globally viable and embrace international trade in order to do that. And that's where these countries really got wealthy, is when they use that initial investment in self-sufficiency to basically then generate wealth at a global level. I think one of the key issues is what's the size of your market ultimately?
Yeah.
Because if you're a very small country, first of all, you're not going to be able to build self-sufficiency in many sectors. It's not economically viable. And secondly, even if you did, you very quickly are going to reach saturation point. So you have to find ways to expand your market.
Yeah.
Which then gets you into neoliberal trade.
Again, yeah. There's been a disparity in the way democratic governments have handled COVID from the way non-democratic governments have handled it. Do you think there'll be a knock-on effect in the way democratic society operates? A kind of a re-examination of what expertise is, what decisive actors mean, generally that kind of a debate?
I think so. And this is only at the sort of the idea that our democracy is better than authoritarian governments is more really sort of the tip of the iceberg. And it may get us only so far. There are some democratic governments, let's say in Denmark or New Zealand, that have done well. And there are some democratic governments that are done very poorly, and vice versa with authoritarian governments. But I think the more interesting issue is that the pandemic is a stress test. It's like, you remember we used to talk in the United States about stress tests to banks.
Exactly, yeah.
Put them under a lot of pressure to see where their vulnerabilities are.
Yeah.
So a lot of countries have been put under tremendous amount of stress, and we're seeing where the problems are. And the problems are not necessarily always at the leadership level. Take the United States. The vulnerability of the United States is that it does not have a healthcare system. It has 50 states, each of which are in charge of their own healthcare and social guidelines. And it is also vulnerable to economic downturns in ways that other countries are not, because we don't also have in the United States, we don't have social security system. People go unemployed. There's no way to protect them. They're on their own. So in the stress test, the American system has basically failed, more so than, let's say, just the president or not. So if you were to have that debate in the United States, you would say that we need a healthcare system. We need a much better healthcare system. Even Russia has a lower death rate per million than the United States, because they have a kind of at least a much more of a community health system than we have.
Right.
That we don't have any kind of a social security system that you could demand of people to be able to not work for a period of time. And we have a decentralized implementation system that could make one state be much more successful, like California, than another state. And I do think that's going to be a much more interesting part of the debate. What is it that in small states, large states, medium-sized states, that accounts for success? How did they manage the stress test? So I think in the case of UAE, for instance, you would look at the number of people who were infected and died, and it's fairly low. The healthcare part was contained quickly. The response to the economic shock has been fairly quick and decisive. Even the very fact that you're saying there's already thinking about what sort of economy comes next. Suggestive of that. So I think that's going to be much more debated than just necessarily whether democracies are doing better than authoritarian governments. I mean, in a way, the COVID is really about competence, expertise, and the quality of your bureaucracy.
Yeah, well, it's funny because when you mentioned that the US is made up of 50 or so states, and yeah, each state has its own policy. Well, even the Emirates, even though we do have a federal structure, we have a federal government, we have federal guidelines, at the level of cities, we have actually noticed different policies. Some are much more focused on lockdown and quarantine, others are a little more open about it. And it's interesting because there are all these feedback loops. We begin to see what works in one emirate as opposed to another emirate. So I just think that overall we've been really quite impressed with ourselves, given what's happening globally. So Professor Vali, thank you so much as a friend of the Emirates to have given us your time. I apologize if I didn't make all of my questions as incisive as your answers, but it's been really wonderful to hear you today. And if I could just thank everybody else for having attended and having spent time with us. Really looking forward to the next session. And if there's anything you'd like to say, Professor?
I wanted to thank you for inviting me to this session. It was a very rich conversation. And I wish you much luck with this project, which I think will benefit the UAE in many ways along the lines that you described.
Thank you, Professor. I'm going to use all of your points today for my next talk, and I'm going to present them as my own ideas. Thank you so much. Really wonderful to have you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.